Okay, good afternoon. I think it's time to start our session. Welcome to our session at Groene Peper on LEAP, the Lower Energy Acceleration Program. My name is Frank Hartkamp, and we have one speaker, Mark Hope, from the Amsterdam Economic Board. So, Mark, welcome. We have a few general comments to make. This session will be recorded. Maybe you can put on the next slide, Mark. The team organizing the event, and next slide. The chat function is on, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and Mark will see them, and I will see them. And for reasons of connectivity, please put off your camera and microphone during the session towards the discussion at the end of the session. And Mark, I think we can start with your presentation.
Okay, great, thanks. So now I have to click here. So welcome everybody, and looking forward to the session. There's going to be four main things I want to talk about. So the main topic is sustainable digitalization. I'll first talk about the problem. I'll talk about who are we, LEAP, what do we do, and how do we make use of trends and opportunities that we see, and what are we building on now. But first, I'm kind of curious what you guys are, where you guys are coming from and what you're interested in. So please use the chat to just say like your general background. Are you studying? Are you a communicator? Are you a researcher? And if there's something specific that you are looking to hear and to get out of this session, I will read it, and maybe I will manage to integrate it into the story. So having said that, I will now move on. So the problem. So I think for some of you, this will not be new. These are just some numbers. It's not very easy to get. We're not yet 100% consolidated on the right numbers for this industry. Also because in a lot of spaces, it's not very easy to get the right data. But you could say that the digital economy is, of course, very important. It has been growing a lot, especially due to Corona, been accelerating. The growth in data use that is expected for the next 10 years is huge. There is we are also expecting still 50% growth in surface area used by data centers and I think this is for the metropolitan region. Amsterdam, and the electricity used by the ICT sector in the Netherlands was 3.9% of the total electricity use in the Netherlands. So just the point is to show that this is a big sector and that it is growing over time. Then we have these two pictures. This shows one of the issues that's been on the newspapers a lot recently, net congestion. So the right picture shows the areas in red where you cannot start or connect your new business to the grid anymore. The left picture shows where you cannot connect your energy production to the grid anymore. So obviously this poses a lot of this is a big challenge for economy in general. And secondly, you see that these are the past 3 years. 4 years, how many days we have had a negative electricity price cumulative. So now this is quite recent. It's from the 30th of May. You see the green line. We've already had around 30 hours of a negative electricity price. Why I show this picture is because it shows on the one hand there is a shortage, or let's say a limitation of access to electricity, and at the same time there seems to be an excess of energy that we are not making use of. But then the problem from a very different direction, all this electricity, all this ICT equipment is using a lot of materials. So this is a study done by Corporate and Metabolic into the material use of our ICT sector, and they are expecting. So they are here. You see the estimate of when in 2040, 2050, Netherlands will demand about 25% of the global iridium production and 50% of lithium, and of course, and that's until the same for neodymium and dysprosium and cobalt. Whilst the Netherlands is about 1.5% of global GDP, and I think something like 0.2% of global inhabitants. So it doesn't take a lot. It doesn't need a lot to realize that there's going to be some sort of mismatch if we demand already 25%. What's about the rest of the world? And then we have this, of course, a lot in the news. Meta coming to Zeewolde. This for me shows that this ICT has also not just an impact on our energy grid and a connection to the energy grid. It has also a connection to materials, and it has a very spatial dimension. So it takes space, and space is very contested, of course, in the Netherlands because we don't have that much of it. So you see that there's a lot of also debate now about what do we want with our ICT infrastructure. And here you see, this is a picture I made to show how there's a split incentive and there's a lot of different parties looking at each other. So the ministry is not sure who is actually responsible for this topic. The businesses, they are pointing, they say, well, the ministry should come, the government should come with regulation, and the grid operator should come with electricity. Grid operator says, well, we cannot change this fast. We need people, we need businesses to help us. And everyone is more or less pointing to citizens saying, well, if we want sustainability, it should also start with behavior from the citizens. And at the same time, we have citizens also at the end of the day suffering the consequences when things are not working out. So what do you do in this kind of situation? You can, of course, tell yourself it's fine. And we should keep it gezellig. But that's, I don't think that's, and I'm not saying, by the way, that our Prime Minister is doing that. I just thought it was nice to put him up there and also give him some credit. But I do think that in short, we are lacking, also because the topic has been changing so quick over time. We are lacking ownership and a coherent framework of policy at the government level. The government is still looking at this is such a broad topic, touching so many different sectors, dimensions, where to exactly place it. And we need collaboration across domains, also across the supply chain. And because this is not here, we are facing challenges in the energy use, the spatial integration, what I talked about, and the use of rare earth metals and materials. So to phrase it the other way around, we think that to achieve sustainability, we need digitalization. So smart applications can have has a lot of potential to help us in the sustainability transitions. This is also why the European Union, of course, is always emphasizing these twin transition. But at the same time, digitalization itself must also happen sustainably. So who are we? LEAP is a coalition that stands for Sustainable Digitalization. We connect public and private parties in the Netherlands who are front runners on this topic. And LEAP started out, Frank already in the beginning talked about our acronym. We started out by focusing on a project with data centers on how they can be more efficient in their energy use. And the project was successful. It was a pilot about eco modus, which is the kind of modus for your server, so that they in the peak or in the downtime it doesn't take as much energy. And what we did is we quantified how much you can save with this, and this helped to put it on the list of interventions that companies can are asked to do. And after that, LEAP kind of expanded. So we realized, okay, it's not just about energy, and it's definitely not just about efficiency. This morning I listened to Dan, who is also someone that we work with a lot from the SDIA, and he also emphasized how we should stop thinking just from efficiency terms and look at it from a broader, more integral perspective. Not in the last place because of the Jevons paradox that he also referenced, that efficiency gains will not automatically lead to net reductions, because we tend to use more of something when we become more efficient at it. So we think that we should really start thinking from a different perspective, and that requires a lot of things. But one of the important things is that we will need a lot of these different players to come together, and we cannot just point just at one of them and expect them to solve it. So what does LEAP do? We connect because we are a network. We set the agenda because we put these issues on the agenda, and we provide a frame of how can you look at it. What do you think are the important things to take into consideration according to us? We experiment, so we do very concrete projects together with different parties. So in our network, there are data centers, there are grid operators, there is municipalities, there are startups who have innovative cooling solutions. There are software developers like VMware. There are users of data centers who also own data centers like banks, but also cloud providers like Microsoft. So it's a very diverse collective, and we bring those together around a couple of topics, and we do projects with them. And when results come out, we communicate them, of course. So we disseminate knowledge, and we do also, along with experiment, is also a knowledge building. So we also participate in knowledge projects with universities. And overall, the attitude is to really look at what can be done. So to take in these critical comments. I also curious what you guys have to say about this. If you have comments on what we do, and to hear your remarks. So within LEAP, we have a couple of topics. It's broadly divided in green solutions, circular, and distributed. And green solutions focuses on what are then new technologies, like photonics, but also what can be done in the green software space. This morning I had a talk with Dan, where we looked at what should be the focus for this group, and it's broadly divided into looking at monitoring, looking at tools. What tools can you offer to software developers so that they actually will build software that is more efficient in its energy use right now? This is not really taken into account. And finally, also collecting best practices. The second big pillar is circularity. So that also for us an important focus is on procurement. So when you are buying service, how can you take into account the material, the carbon, embedded carbons, but also other materials that are in there. And distributed is I would say, I mean, we have innovation aspects in all of these, but distributed is the most is the most conceptual in that sense. Distributed is looking at how would a fundamentally different system, what would a fundamentally different system look like, where we are trying to, instead of having these centralized hyperscale, or let's say next to centralized hyperscale data centers, also have more decentralized data centers that for example, using edge technologies. But I will say a bit more about that later. And below you will just see a couple of logos of the people that we work with in our different projects. So what are then these? What is our focus, and what kind of opportunities do we see? Obviously, it's working on these kind of transitions is complex and takes a long time, and it's not in the last place because it is a transition on multiple domains. It requires new business models. It requires different behavior from procurement, from users. It requires new technologies, although I think a lot of technologies are already there, and it requires institutional changes. So. What I talked about in the beginning, how there is not not having a very clear ownership, for example, within the institutions is challenging. So that's why we believe that we have to bring together all these different parties in order to address these issues. And by doing so, we are making use of a lot of trends. So in the beginning, I described a couple of problems that we see. But of course, there's also a lot of good things happening. So there's a big trend of decentralization through different types of technologies, but also what we see now, the photovoltaic that is really picking up, especially with the increasing energy prices. That's probably the only silver lining, or one of the few silver linings of this whole crisis, but also flexibilization on the grid. So flexibilization means that that we are becoming that. Amongst other things, because of new, for example, smart applications and software, you can be more flexible in your demand and supply. So, so that not when everyone comes home and plugs in their bike and their car, if everyone would start charging and using the washing machine at the same time, of course, it causes a lot of peaks, especially now that we more and more things are electrified, and flexibilization means that we now have more and more technologies that allow us to distribute this demand in time. So that you might say, okay, I wait a bit until the peak is over before my bike starts charging. New technologies that we are working a lot with is, of course, what I said before, the edge computing, also very much enabled by photonics, using light instead of electrons when transporting and working with data computing. But also innovative cooling, where you move from air cooling to liquid cooling or even immersed, which allows to recapture heat a lot better and therefore also make much better use of the energy that is being used. And of course also new awareness. So we just did a very nice research on for distributed. How can you combine functionalities in the built environment? So how could you introduce data centers to the built environment and try to combine it with other functions? So add it up onto existing transformer houses, or add it to a farm. And we see that sustainability in general is getting more and more attention. We see also slowly more awareness that a lot of externalities are not priced in, and they start being at least taken into account through sustainability reports and perhaps even eventually priced in. And that, of course, makes the case for a lot of the solutions that we are working with also much more attractive. So one example that is still quite out there, and of course has a lot of questions around it, but that is also nice and interesting, I think, is that what I mentioned before, one of our working groups is looking at a distributed energy data system. So what could that, for example, look like? This is one of the things that we within LEAP are exploring, because we think it is it could play a role in a future energy and data system, where you have local solutions in addition to existing hyperscalers. So here, I don't know if you see my mouse, but here's the Teams tower. Maybe some of you know these small houses, these that are owned by the grid operators in the city, which have always this like lightning bolt on the side of it. So this architecture and spatial design firm calculated for us, if you would in the metropolitan region Amsterdam use all of those to store away what is the projected need for data center services, which is approximately 1 million square meters. This is just a thought experiment. Obviously, it's not like it would exactly be like this. It's just as a thought experiment. And now we will try to test if this actually works. You could stack it up until you need 13,000 of them, and you could stack them up like this. And then you could have a data center inside, like these small data center towers within the city. But you could also use the windmills, of which there are about 143 within the MRA, and you could maybe layer it on top of it. Or this is also nice. It's a water cleaning installation. If you would. There's 23 of them in the metropolitan region Amsterdam, and then you could create structures like these on their terrains, and there you would also have probably a nice local application of heat, residual heat. So this is one thing where you try to. This is where we are experimenting with design, looking at, if you look through the design lens, not being limited by business logic or what is possible and now, but just to expand our imagination. What are different ways which we can imagine data centers? And on the other hand, we are also working with companies like VMware to look at how far are we now, what is possible to allow for this flexibilization of the demand. So on one hand, it's like, how do we have different ways of constructing these data centers, and on the other hand, how can we be more flexible in the demand, so that the demand is flexible in time, but also in space. And especially the second part is the biggest challenge, which is only very few companies right now are doing it. And the idea is that you could move computing tasks that do not need to be done within the next hour or within the next 5 hours. You could maybe move them across space and move along with where the demand or where the supply of energy is at that time. So here I wrote, when the wind is blowing in South Holland, the service will perform extra tasks. So you have companies that are connected, and it automatically shifts computing tasks to those servers. In that way, you can the data center services can help to balance the current imbalances in the energy grid. So instead of having even more big spaceships that are constantly churning and using electricity, that pull out more electricity from this electricity grid that is already overheated, as you saw in these earlier maps, you try to move the data across the grid instead of the electricity, and move the data and the computing to those places where the energy is available. So this will definitely not work for everything. It will not be the solution for everything, but it could be a part of the solutions. And we think these kind of new approaches and new ways of thinking, new logics, because you are trying to really think from how can we make it, how can it be rewarded to balance? How can you have these sense and response, have these much more real-time exchange between different data centers, so they exchange tasks. And how could you even have maybe more like, and then also local ownership and local use of the, for example, the residual heat. So instead of heating up the air above the IJsselmeer, to make use of the residual heat and find local applications for it. These are a couple of new ways of thinking that we think are important to explore when looking at the future and the sustainable digitalization. Let's see. So what is next for us? As said before, we are continuing with these different areas that we're working in. We have our coalition where energy, the energy domain, the data domain, and the spatial domain is coming together. We are trying to connect them through events, but also through specific projects. We do agenda setting. So we published not so long ago our LEAP technology landscape, which was describing what kind of technologies do we see coming that are relevant for the data center sector for the next 3 to 10 years. But now we are working on a manifesto for what should be the core components of sustainable digitalization also, and it's something that we will also be handing out towards the policymakers. We are experimenting, so we're doing research now on what are photonics applications that are happening right now and are possible. We are looking at innovative cooling. We are looking at Replan IT, that is a very interesting circular procurement initiative where we're trying to quantify and create a model for procurers that can help them in decision making and when buying new equipment. And we applied for MOI funding, which is to work out some of these distributed concepts. And of course, we communicate. In the past, we have communicated a happy flow manual, which was the result of this pilot of eco-modus that I mentioned before. So to go to the next slide and to sum up. I talked about the challenges that we see, challenges in energy, challenges in data, challenges in space. I talked about trends and opportunities, and I went specifically into this distributed concept, which, as said before, it is one of the ideas, and I think it is interesting and inspiring because it really allows you to think of how can we do it from a different logic. But obviously, it is just part of the equation that will also have to be done. Also, a lot can still be done in terms of use of residual heat, for example, different cooling techniques, but also more efficient computing. These are also very important parts of the solution. And of course, finding and of course also having policy that supports these developments. And I talked about the working groups we have, the different activities we do. To give you kind of an overview of what is it then what is it concretely that we do. My role in these is that I'm coordinating the different working groups. So I'm sitting in on all these different projects. I'm not a software engineer. I'm not a data scientist or a data engineer for that matter. Or an engineer, any engineer for that matter. So my knowledge is coming from these sessions, but it's not from my background. But of course, if you'd like to know more about any of these specific topics, then I would just like to open the conversation. and ask people to either chat or unmute. And I'm also curious, if you have no questions to me, what role you would like to play, and reflecting on what I have said, what do you see as a role for yourself in this transition towards sustainable digitalization? This is my story. I'm gonna cut the screen because I am curious what you think.
Well, thank you, Mark, for the presentation. And I hear an enormous echo. Nevertheless, if anyone wants to raise any question, so please make yourself known and ask what you would like to know. I don't see too many questions being raised, Mark.
Yeah,
so
I see one, but Barbara is asking about the skills and competencies you need, students need to play a role in this transition. So, yeah, this is of course it's a very broad question, and I think it also depends on the domain. But one of the key parts of my whole story is, of course, this looking across domains. And also in my work, the reason why I have a job in the first place is because very often people who are experts on their specific domain find it very challenging to work together or to cooperate with people who have expertise in very different domain. So my role is to facilitate these kind of conversations. And I think that a great skill for students to have is to have this to have experience with and to do this interdisciplinary thinking. And I know this is already known for some time, but I think it continues to be a relevant skill, especially looking at how integral a lot of these challenges are. You see what I talked about, these different transitions, they are touching upon so many different domains. That is one thing. And I think, yeah, if you talk about to play a role in this transition, look, one of the projects we do about green software right now, I would say a lot software development, if you look at it from an environmental perspective, it's kind of a wild west. Like there's just no, just from an environmental perspective, because the costs are not accounted for. You are not, as a software developer, you are not hardly really incentivized to make the most energy efficient software. Of course, a fast software, so that is, you know, not unnecessarily doing calculations to some extent, is also more energy efficient, and therefore, but it's not really part of the awareness. So I think that also for students to ask these kind of questions about, even if the kind of common sense is that in the field is not to take these kind of costs into consideration, to still ask yourself these kind of questions. What are the real world impacts that any kind of product or service I'm developing has? I think those are very important. That is an important skill, to ask those kind of questions, because especially since still a lot of people seem to think that the cloud is something out there that doesn't have any material base. It's not the case. So let's see. This is from another person, Groene Business. Yeah, reducing the steep demand for data. Yeah, that's I think almost a question you should ask to Frank. In my if you look, if like in the graph that I made with the people pointing the fingers at each other, I think if you would ask those parties, most people would say reduce the demand of data, responsibility lies with the consumer, which I think is unfair, because it's not very fair to ask the consumer to make less use of data services, and when they're actually not very informed about what the alternatives are or what the impacts are in the first place of their decisions. So I have to admit that I myself even am not still 100% decided about this topic, because I have on the one hand a tendency to say maybe we are too often looking for technological solutions where the solution can be very social and not very data intensive. So instead of training huge AIs, you could also have stronger institutions that allow people to make decisions and do the sensing instead of having a lot of sensors and trying to capture all the data and then translate it into models. People at the end of the day are great sensors. So I myself am not so 100% decided on it, but I do think a very important part will be about stop externalizing costs. So internalizing costs for materials, internalizing costs for the energy use that this data has, and also and maybe even thinking about the kind of social consequences, the debates that are going on now about data sovereignty and data ownership. Once you would start incorporating those costs, I think data use would be a lot less cheap than it is now, and it would very much change the business case. Having said all that, from a LEAP perspective, we do kind of work on the assumption that the data use will continue, and that it is also an important part of moving, and it plays an important role in sustainability. So we are asking ourselves how, if we see this data growing, this data use growing, how can we do that and sustain it and do it in the most sustainable way?
Well, maybe I can make a comment on that. I once heard a professor in sustainability say that maybe one should send less emails and send once in a while a postcard instead. But then we make steps backwards, I guess, for all the paper use and all the logistics on sending a postcard. So in a way, much of the digitalization makes things more efficient, using less material, using less fossil fuel. But then, with all the enormous amount of growth in data use, one needs more ways to handle this. And I guess one of the techniques to be used is to work on data deduplication, so that data is stored only once, and of course also the way you handle data inside your organization or with a private space, and the awareness of all the pictures you have from holidays, etc., stored in the cloud. Will all those photographs will use electricity as long as you keep them stored in the cloud. So if you think there's a real need for them to use this electricity, well, you can have them, leave them in the cloud. But if you say, well, there's no reason for these pictures to use any electricity anymore, well, then you should stop it. And that this is a thing of awareness.
Yeah, I think that's what Ernst is also asking about, right? Like, can we delete data after a couple of years? And I guess Ernst knows the statistic that it was once estimated that over 90% of the photos and images or data stored in data centers is accessed never or hardly ever again. But those servers are still there. They are either on or on standby, and they're decommissioned after a couple of years. So there's huge embodied carbon then disappearing. So I definitely cannot decide whether we should delete data after a number of years, but I do think that there is definitely an interesting case for thinking more critically about it. I'm also curious if there's people who are really disagreeing with this story, or who think that it's not, there are some issues with it, or if there's still unclarities. And otherwise, I hand it back to Frank. Yeah, you are mute.
Frank, you should unmute.
Oh, sorry. I think we are coming to a conclusion of the session where there's no too many questions anymore. But just to add one more, when people want to connect to LEAP, doing research or wanting to participate in research being done, or what should people do? Should they call you or send an email or go to Amsterdam and go to your office or what, Mark?
Yeah, they should just email me. And as I said, we do quite a broad range of. Oh, Hans waving. Yeah, we do quite a broad range of things. So if you've heard anything that you think, hey, this is touching upon what I'm doing, we often get approached by people who are working in this field, who are working in related fields. For example, recently or last week, a guy approached me who was working in as a consultant on cloud, and he said, I got some time from my boss to explore more sustainable alternatives. And so I'm using him, I'm integrating him in the working groups. So there's a lot of different ways in which you can connect.
And you talked about research being done. Is this can people read this research and find it on the internet?
So right now the main way we publish is through the website that is also on the page that describes this talk. That's where you can. From the economic board, if we publish new researches, you will find it through the Amsterdam Economic Board. This year, LEAP is in kind of a transition, so it may be that by the end of the year, we will have our own website or we will be posting it somewhere else. But that also you will see through the Amsterdam Economic Board. So if you follow the Economic Board, you will hear the most recent things.
The link is in the program on the website on the paper. Okay, thank you very much. And the next steps of LEAP in the next few months, what do you hope for? What will LEAP?
Yeah, I hope that we are now bringing together an important part of our partners to write a manifest, to kind of write down what are now the core challenges and what core solutions do we see when it comes to sustainable digitalization. So when this is done, you will read about it in the news. And I hope that this is being picked up and that either other organizations or we together with other organizations will be able to continue working on it to put this topic bigger on the agenda and also to help government to organize itself around it. And at the same time, I hope we continue building on our different innovation and experimental tracks and do nice collaborations with our partners.
Okay, thank you, Mark de Hoop from the Amsterdam Economic Board on LEAP. I hope you will be back next year to tell about the next steps being formed. And I will thank all the audience this afternoon for being present. Next days there will be more sessions on Groene Peper until Friday on circular economy and on the sustainable food and digitalization and all the rest. So I hope you will enjoy the next sessions as well in the program. Hope to see you again. We have some conclusive slides. Mark, maybe you can put it on. Yes. Okay. So thank you very much and have a good evening and bye-bye.